They cut the patch off her backpack because it was non-regulation. It was a simple, faded black square, sewn onto the worn canvas with thread that had seen more sun and sand than the fresh-faced privates guarding the gate. To them, and to the rigid command structure of Forward Operating Base Kestrel, it was a small act of defiance, an anomaly that had to be corrected. The officer who saw the symbol inside, the one that proved the black square was a mask, not a decoration, wouldn't understand its true meaning until the base was on the verge of being wiped from the map. But by then, the patch would be long gone, and the woman who wore it would be the only thing standing between order and chaos. Her arrival was as quiet as the heat rising from the packed earth. One moment the transport ramp was empty, the next she was there, a single duffel bag in one hand, the offending backpack slung over her shoulder. Her paperwork identified her as Specialist Alina Rostova, a communications technician reassigned from a rear echelon depot. The designation was a box to check, a label that allowed the base's bureaucracy to process her existence. No one looked twice. She was just another body, another cog in the machine grinding away in the desolate expanse of the Uzbek corridor. She was of average height, with a build that suggested endurance over strength, and a face that gave nothing away. Her eyes, a pale, steady gray, were the only remarkable thing about her. They swept over the base not with the awe of a newcomer, but with the flat, analytical gaze of a surveyor assessing a piece of land for its flaws. Two soldiers, Corporal Evans and Private Chen, watched her from the shade of a comms tower. Evans nudged Chun with his elbow. "Look at that. Another tech. Probably here to tell us we're coiling our fiber optic cables wrong." Chun grunted, his eyes fixed on the black patch. "What's with the Goth badge? That's not a unit patch I've ever seen." "It's not a unit patch, period," Evans said, a note of derision in his voice. "It's a violation of AR 670-1, is what it is. $10 says the colonel has it off her by sundown." Alina heard them. The desert air carried sound with perfect clarity. She registered their words as data points, input to be filed away about the base's culture. Observant, critical of outsiders, devoted to the minutiae of regulation. She felt no anger, no embarrassment. Their opinions were irrelevant. She walked past them without a flicker of acknowledgement, her boots making soft, rhythmic sounds in the dust. She found the administrative tent, presented her orders to a bored-looking sergeant who pointed her toward a barracks. And that was that. She was absorbed into the base, a ghost in the machine before she had even unpacked. She chose a bunk in the corner, away from the main flow of traffic, and methodically arranged her meager belongings. The backpack she placed at the foot of her cot with deliberate care. The black square faced outward. It wasn't a challenge. It was simply its place. For the rest of the day, she observed. She watched the shift changes at the perimeter fence, noting the predictable timing and the slight sag in the guard's posture during the hottest part of the afternoon. She observed the flow of vehicles in and out of the motor pool, memorizing the types and their maintenance schedules by the sounds of their engines. She sat in the mess hall, eating her meal slowly, her senses taking in the complex social dynamics, the alliances and rivalries, the loud and the quiet. She was a predator in a new environment, learning the patterns of the herd not to attack, but to understand the system's inherent weaknesses. The patch on her bag was just a piece of fabric, but the silence she cultivated around herself was her true camouflage. It made her invisible, and in a place like FOB Kestrel, invisibility was a form of armor. The confrontation came, as Evans had predicted, just before sundown. Colonel Madson was a man carved from granite and regulations, his posture ramrod straight, his face a permanent mask of stern disapproval. He believed discipline was a religion, and uniformity was its primary sacrament. He cornered Alina as she was leaving the communications hub, where she'd been assigned the menial task of cataloging spare parts. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Specialist," he began, his voice a low growl that cut through the evening air. He deliberately left off her name, a subtle power play to establish her insignificance. "I am Colonel Madson. I am the commander of this installation. And on my installation, we follow the United States Army's regulations on uniform and appearance. To the letter." He gestured with a rigid finger toward her backpack, which she held by its strap in one hand. That piece of black cloth on your personal effects. It is not an authorized insignia. It is not a unit patch. It is not a flag. It is, therefore, an unauthorized modification, and it will be removed. Immediately, Alina looked from his face to the patch, then back again. Her expression remained placid, her gray eyes unblinking. She could have explained. She could have told him it was a memento, a memorial to a past he couldn't possibly comprehend. She could have refused, cited some obscure codicil, or simply asked why. She did none of these things. Explanations were a form of negotiation, and she was not there to negotiate. She was there to do a job, a quiet job in a quiet place, until she was called to do something else. "Understood, sir," she said. Her voice was calm, even devoid of any emotion. She set the backpack down on a nearby crate. From a small pocket on her belt, she produced a standard-issue utility knife. With a surgeon's precision, she flicked the blade out. She didn't rip or tear at the patch. She slid the fine point of the knife under the first stitch and sliced it cleanly. Then the next and the next. The soldiers who had stopped to watch the spectacle expected a show of defiance, a sullen glare, a muttered curse. They got nothing. Her movements were economical and detached, as if she were defusing a bomb or field-stripping a rifle. The only sound was the faint, repetitive snip, snip, snip of the threads giving way. Colonel Madson watched, his arms crossed, a smug sense of victory on his face. He had enforced his will. He had maintained order. He saw her compliance as submission, the natural bending of a subordinate to a superior. He did not see the unnerving control in her hands, the absolute stillness of her body. He did not see that she wasn't just cutting threads. She was performing a practiced, ritualistic act of concealment. When the last thread was cut, she lifted the black square of fabric, folded it once, and slipped it into her pocket. She picked up her backpack, which now bore a lighter, cleaner square on its faded canvas, a ghost of what had been there. "Regulation complied with, sir," she said, her tone as flat as before. "See that it stays that way, specialist," Madson grunted and turned on his heel, his duty done. Alina slung the backpack over her shoulder and walked away, melting back into the shadows of the base. The other soldiers dispersed, muttering. They had seen a new transfer get put in her place. But Alina hadn't been put in her place. She had simply allowed the colonel to rearrange the furniture in a room he didn't know existed. The patch was gone from the outside, but what it covered, what it stood for, remained. And it was sewn to the inside for a reason. In the days that followed, Alina settled into a routine of quiet efficiency. She was assigned to the supply depot attached to the comms hub, a sweltering, dusty tent filled with crates of electronics, spools of cable, and forgotten hardware. Her job was inventory. It was tedious, mind-numbing work intended for soldiers who couldn't be trusted with more critical tasks. But Alina approached it with the same methodical focus she applied to everything. She didn't just count the items. She assessed them. She opened sealed boxes of satellite transceivers, noting their firmware versions and checking them against the latest threat intelligence bulletins she had memorized years ago. The base's tech was 2 generations out of date, a critical vulnerability. She traced the power lines running to the main server racks, noting the lack of surge protection and the single point of failure at the primary generator. She ran a diagnostic on a discarded network analyzer and discovered it was still functional, a powerful tool left to gather dust. While others saw piles of junk, she saw a system full of holes. She mapped these vulnerabilities in her mind, creating a mental schematic of the base's nervous system, noting every weak connection, every unpatched flaw, every potential point of collapse. She was a ghost in the wires, learning the architecture of her new home. Her observation extended beyond the hardware. She learned the rhythms of the base. She knew which guard on the south perimeter was prone to distraction, his eyes lingering on a worn photograph a few minutes past the hour. She knew the patrol routes of the quick reaction force were so predictable you could set a watch by them. She listened to the radio chatter, not for its content, but for its cadence. The operators were sloppy, their protocols loose, their speech filled with slang that could be easily mimicked. The entire installation, from its digital infrastructure to its human element, was a brittle shell. It operated on the assumption that its routines were its strength, when in fact they were its greatest weakness. No one paid her any mind. She was the quiet tech who did her work without complaint. She ate alone, she kept to herself, and she never spoke unless spoken to. To Colonel Madson, she was a problem solved. To Evans and Chun, she was a curiosity that had faded. They saw her sitting in the shade, cleaning her rifle with a focused intensity that was slightly unnerving, or reading dense technical manuals in the dim light of the barracks. They mistook her stillness for passivity, her silence for simplicity. They had no idea they were living alongside a weapon that had simply been placed in its scabbard. Alina didn't mind the solitude. It gave her time to think, to watch, and to wait. She knew, with the certainty of long and bitter experience, that systems this flawed did not last forever. Something would eventually break. And when it did, routines and regulations would be meaningless. The pressure began as a whisper on the wind. A low, keening sound that signaled the approach of a shamel, one of the vicious sandstorms that could scour the landscape for days. But this was different. An unnatural stillness preceded it, an oppressive silence that even the insects seemed to respect. Then the electronics began to fail. First, it was the long-range comms array. The signal didn't just degrade. It vanished, replaced by a perfect, seamless wall of white noise. The technicians in the command hub stared at their screens in disbelief. It wasn't equipment failure. This was deliberate. This was electronic warfare. Colonel Madson stormed into the hub, his face a thundercloud. "What is going on? Get me a link to command. Now." The chief technician, a young lieutenant named Harris, was sweating, his hands flying across a keyboard. "I can't, sir. The entire spectrum is blanketed. It's a sophisticated jamming signal looping back on itself. Every frequency we try is instantly swallowed. We're deaf and blind." Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle the air. A comms blackout was a death sentence in the corridor. It meant no air support, no reinforcements, no intelligence. FOB Kestrel was alone. As if on cue, the secondary systems began to flicker. The perimeter sensors went dead, their feeds dissolving into static. The network targeting systems on the heavy machine guns blinked red, then went dark. The base's digital eyes and ears had been severed in a matter of minutes. The chaos in the hub intensified. Voices were raised. Fingers were pointed. Madson was barking orders that had no effect, demanding solutions his technicians couldn't provide. They were trying to fight a ghost with a sledgehammer, running conventional diagnostics against an unconventional attack. They were trained to follow procedures, to reboot systems and check connections. They were not trained for an enemy who could rewrite the rules of the battlefield. Through it all, Alina stood in the doorway of the supply tent, watching. She had felt the shift in the air long before the alarms went off. She had felt the subtle change in the electromagnetic spectrum, a discordant hum beneath the surface of the base's normal chatter. She watched the frantic, useless activity in the command hub. They were trapped in their own procedures, unable to think outside the system that had just been dismantled around them. She saw the fear in their eyes, the dawning realization of their own fragility. And in that moment she made a decision. Her period of quiet observation was over. Her self-imposed exile was at an end. She dropped the diagnostic tool she had been cleaning and began to walk, her steps calm and deliberate, toward the heart of the storm. Alina moved through the chaos of the command hub like a rock in a raging river. The frantic energy of the technicians parted around her. Lieutenant Harris, seeing her approach, waved a dismissive hand. "Not now, specialist. We're in the middle of a crisis." He didn't even look at her, his eyes glued to a screen of cascading, meaningless code. She didn't respond with words. She walked past him to a forgotten corner of the hub, where a panel in the floor was covered by a dusty rubber mat. She kicked the mat aside, revealing a set of heavy-duty bolts. No one else paid her any attention. They were too consumed by their own failing efforts. From her belt, she produced a multi-tool and began to efficiently loosen the bolts. Her movements were precise, betraying a deep, ingrained familiarity with the hardware. This wasn't the action of a simple supply clerk. Harris finally noticed what she was doing. What in God's name do you think you're doing? That's the primary network conduit. You don't have authorization to access that. Alina didn't look up. Your network is compromised, she stated, her voice a flat, factual declaration. The jammer isn't just blocking your signal. It's using your own antenna array to amplify the noise. You're trying to shout through a megaphone that's screaming back at you. You have to disconnect from it. She lifted the heavy plate, revealing a thick bundle of fiber optic and copper cables. Her hands moved with unerring confidence, disconnecting specific lines and ignoring others. She wasn't guessing. She knew the schematic of this system better than the men who operated it every day. From a pouch, she retrieved the old network analyzer she'd found in the supply tent, along with a spool of shielded copper wire. She bypassed the main digital switchboard entirely, plugging the analyzer directly into a hardline diagnostic port, an analog relic from a previous generation of technology. It was a backdoor no one had thought to use or even remembered existed. She ran one end of the copper wire from the analyzer to an auxiliary port on the base's satellite uplink terminal. It was a crude, brute-force connection, an electronic Frankenstein's monster. But it bypassed the compromised digital network. She was creating a new, isolated nervous system from the discarded bones of the old one. What is she doing? Madson demanded, striding over. I have no idea, sir, Harris stammered, watching in a mixture of awe and horror. It's not in any manual. Alina ignored them both. Her focus was absolute. She powered on the analyzer, its small screen flickering to life. Instead of trying to find a clear frequency in the jam spectrum, she used the analyzer to find the source of the looping signal. She isolated its modulation pattern, a complex, rapidly shifting algorithm. Then, she did something that made Harris's jaw drop. She didn't try to break it. She mirrored it. She programmed the old satellite terminal to emit a signal that was a perfect, phase-inverted echo of the jamming signal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a single, clear channel opened up on the analyzer's display. It was a tiny pinprick of silence in an ocean of noise. Destructive interference. She had used the enemy's own weapon against them, creating a narrow, secure tunnel through the electronic storm. She patched the channel through to a single headset on the console. She stood up and turned to the stunned colonel. You have a single, unsecured analog channel to Stratcom, she said, her voice as calm as ever. The bandwidth is low, voice only, and the enemy will know we've broken their blackout. You have maybe 5 minutes before they adapt. She offered no further explanation. She simply stated the facts and stepped back, her intervention complete. The entire command hub was silent. The only sound the faint, clear hiss of an open comms line from the headset she had activated. They stared at her, this quiet supply technician, and for the first time they saw something else entirely. The shift was palpable. It started in the command hub and spread through the base like a current. The 5-minute window Alina had opened was just enough. Madson was able to get off a single, coded burst transmission confirming the electronic attack and their position before the channel collapsed again. But it was enough. The base wasn't entirely alone anymore. Shortly after, a series of targeted artillery strikes, fired from a distant battery on pre-planned coordinates, slammed into the hills overlooking the FOB. The enemy, who had been using the cover of the electronic blackout to move into attack positions, was forced to pull back. The immediate threat was neutralized. The jamming signal eventually ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The base's systems slowly flickered back to life, and in the aftermath the whispers began. Who was Specialist Rostova? Where did a comms tech from a rear echelon depot learn about phase inversion filtering and hardline network bypassing? The technicians who had witnessed her work in the hub spoke in hushed, reverent tones. They described how she had moved with an unnatural calm, her hands sure and steady, diagnosing and fixing in minutes a problem that a dozen experts had failed to even understand. Corporal Evans and Private Chun saw her later, cleaning the dust from the network analyzer she had used. Evans approached her cautiously, his earlier arrogance gone, replaced by a wary respect. "Specialist Rostova," he began. "That was incredible. Where did you learn to do that?" Alina looked up from her work, her gray eyes meeting his. "I read the manuals," she said, the same non-answer she'd given to others. But this time it didn't sound like an evasion. It sounded like a warning. Colonel Madson summoned her to his makeshift office. The condescension was gone from his demeanor, replaced by a guarded curiosity. He sat behind his desk, steepling his fingers, and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Your file says you spent the last 2 years cataloging inventory at Ramstein Air Base. It says your MOS is 25U, Signal Support System Specialist. A good one, apparently, but it doesn't say anything that would explain what you did today." Alina stood at ease before his desk, her posture relaxed but ready. "I had good instructors, sir." Madson leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "I'm not an idiot, Specialist. You didn't just fix a problem. You diagnosed and defeated a state-of-the-art electronic warfare attack with obsolete equipment. That's not something you learn in a standard training course. I've put in a request for your full service record. In the meantime, you are relieved of your duties in the supply depot. You will be assigned to the command hub as a technical advisor. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," she said. "One more thing," Madson added, his gaze flicking to the empty square on her backpack, which was propped against the wall. "That patch I had you remove. What was it?" Alina's expression didn't change. "A piece of cloth, sir." She was dismissed. As she walked out, she knew her anonymity was gone. She was no longer invisible. She was now a puzzle that Colonel Madson was determined to solve. The respect she was being shown was not for who she was, but for what she could do. It was a conditional, transactional respect, born of necessity. It was better than dismissal, but it was still a cage. She knew a second test would not be far behind, and it would be far more dangerous than the first. The second test arrived 3 days later, delivered by the smoking wreckage of a Spectre 7 surveillance drone. The high-altitude, stealth-capable drone was the military's most advanced eye in the sky, and one of them had been brought down by a lucky shot from a new type of surface-to-air missile. It had crashed in the Valley of Whispers, a treacherous maze of canyons and ravines that served as a de facto no-man's land between FOB Kestrel and entrenched insurgent forces. The problem wasn't just the loss of the drone. It was what was inside it. The Spectre 7 was equipped with a next-generation sensor package, and its onboard data core contained detailed scans of every enemy position in a 200-mile radius. If the insurgents recovered that core, the intelligence loss would be catastrophic. The situation in the command hub was tense. A conventional recovery mission was impossible. A full platoon would be spotted miles away, and air support was too risky with the new missile threat. The enemy knew what they had shot down. Their patrols were already converging on the crash site. The satellite imagery showed at least 2 enemy squads closing in. The window to act was 90 minutes, maybe less. "We can't get to it in time," Lieutenant Harris stated, tracing the enemy movements on the digital map. "Their route is more direct. We'd have to go the long way around through the choke points. They'll be there a good 30 minutes before our fastest team could possibly arrive." Colonel Madson stared at the map, his jaw tight. The options were grim. Let the enemy capture billions of dollars in military technology and life-or-death intelligence, or send a team on a suicide mission. He looked around the room, at the grim faces of his officers. Then his eyes landed on Alina. She was standing in the back, observing the map with her usual unnerving stillness. She hadn't offered a single word, but he could see her mind working, her eyes tracing lines on the map that no one else was seeing. "Rostova," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You see a way." All eyes turned to her. Alina stepped forward and pointed to the map, her finger tracing a thin, jagged line through what appeared to be solid, impassable rock formations. "You're thinking about the main routes," she said. "The valley floor. You need to think vertically. These ridges aren't solid. They're karst formations, full of sinkholes and dry riverbeds. There's a network of culverts and storm drainage tunnels beneath this entire section of the valley, built decades ago and long since forgotten. They're not on any modern map." She looked up at Madson. "A small team could use that network to bypass the enemy patrols entirely. Come up right underneath the crash site. It would be fast, quiet, and unexpected." Harris scoffed. "That's insane. We have no idea if those tunnels are even stable. It's a death trap." "It's a chance," Madson countered, his eyes locked on Alina. He was taking a massive gamble, trusting the instincts of a woman whose file was a blank page. "Can you lead this team?" "I can," Alina replied without hesitation. "Who do you need?" Her gaze swept the room, landing on Evans and Chan, who were standing guard by the door. They had been watching her with a mixture of fear and hero worship since the comms incident. "I need 2 volunteers," she said. "People who can follow orders without question and move quietly." Before anyone else could speak, Evans and Chun both took a step forward. "We'll go, specialist," Evans said, his voice firm. Madson nodded slowly. "All right, take them. Get the data core, plant demolition charges on the drone's fuselage, and get out. 90 minutes, Rostova. Your clock starts now." The mission was a descent into a silent, suffocating darkness. Alina led Evans and Chan to an unassuming, great covered opening at the base of a cliff, a place she had identified from geological surveys she'd studied in her spare time. The air that breathed from the tunnel was cold and smelled of damp earth and decay. Without a word, she slipped inside, and they followed. Her leadership was not one of commands and shouts, but of quiet, absolute confidence. She moved through the pitch-black tunnels with an eerie sense of direction, navigating by the feel of the air currents and the subtle incline of the floor. She communicated with a series of precise hand signals, taps on the shoulder, and clicks of her tongue that they quickly learned to interpret. She was not just leading them. She was teaching them a new language, the language of silence and shadows. They moved faster than they thought possible, bypassing the enemy patrols who were scouring the valley floor above them. Twice, they froze as they heard the crunch of boots and muffled voices directly overhead, separated only by a few feet of rock and earth. In those moments, Evans and Chan felt a primal fear, but one look at Alina's calm profile in the dim red light of her headlamp was enough to steady their nerves. She was completely at home in the darkness. They emerged from a narrow fissure in the rock just 50 yards from the crash site. The Spectre 7 drone was a mangled wreck of composite materials and wires, its sleek black form broken against the canyon wall. 2 enemy squads were approaching from opposite directions, their voices carrying clearly on the wind. They were less than 10 minutes away. "Evans, cover that ridge," Alina whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Chen, you're with me. We extract the core. Move." They worked with frantic, disciplined speed. Chan stood guard while Alina, using a specialized tool from her pack, began to cut through the drone's armored casing to access the data core. The sound of her high-torque drill was terrifyingly loud in the quiet canyon. Just as she pulled the heavy, orange-colored cylinder free, a shout echoed from the ridge. One of the patrols had spotted them. Instantly, the air was filled with the crack of rifle fire. Evans returned fire from his overwatch position, buying them precious seconds. "We're compromised," he yelled. "Plant the charges," Alina ordered Chun, handing him the demolition packs. As Chun slapped the magnetic charges onto the drone's fuselage, a stray round ricocheted off the wreckage and tore through the side of Alina's backpack, which she had set on the ground. She didn't even flinch. She grabbed the core, slung the damaged pack over her shoulder, and they began to fall back toward the fissure. They made it back to the tunnels just as the drone erupted in a massive fireball, the explosion echoing like thunder through the canyon. Their retreat was a desperate, adrenaline-fueled scramble through the darkness, the sounds of the enraged enemy fading behind them. They emerged back at the base 94 minutes after they had left, exhausted, bruised, but alive. and in Alina's hand was the data core. In the command hub, the mood was electric. They had the intelligence. The mission was a success. As Alina placed the core on the debriefing table, Colonel Madson gave her a nod of profound respect. But as she turned, the torn flap of her backpack fell open. The contents spilled slightly and everyone saw it. Sewn into the reinforced inner lining of the pack, now visible through the gash in the outer canvas, was a small, intricately stitched symbol. It was matte black, designed to absorb light. A stylized owl, its wings spread as if in silent flight. In its talons, it clutched a single, downward-pointing dagger. Most of the soldiers in the room saw only a strange design. But Madson froze. He had seen that symbol once before in a top-secret briefing years ago. It was the insignia of a unit that, officially, did not exist. A ghost unit used for the most sensitive and dangerous operations in the world. Task Force 117. Designation: Nightfall. At that exact moment, the door to the hub opened and a master sergeant entered. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of hard-fought campaigns, and he wore the insignia of the Joint Special Operations Command. He was there to oversee the data core's transport. He swept his gaze over the room, and then he saw Alina. His eyes widened in disbelief. He completely ignored Colonel Madson and the other officers, walking directly toward her. He stopped, his expression a mixture of shock and reverence. He looked at her, then at the exposed symbol in her pack. He spoke a single word, a name that was a ghost story whispered in the intelligence community, a legend credited with a dozen impossible missions that had changed the course of history. "Nix," he breathed. "By God, we all thought you were dead." The name dropped into the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Nix, the ghost of Kandahar, the architect of the Silent Accord. A name that was spoken in the same breath as myth. Colonel Madson stared at Alina, the quiet supply technician, the woman he had publicly chastised for a piece of black cloth. He looked at the owl and dagger, the symbol of the most elite operational unit on the planet. He looked at the master sergeant, a hardened JSOC veteran, standing before her as if in the presence of royalty. And in that instant, everything clicked into place. The unnerving calm, the impossible skill with electronics, the preternatural tactical awareness. The black patch on her backpack hadn't been a piece of flair. It had been a shroud, a deliberate act of hiding a past so extraordinary that it couldn't be allowed to see the light of day. He had ordered a legend to cut a piece of her own history off, and she had done it without a word of protest. The humiliation he felt was profound, a cold weight in his stomach. Alina's face remained a mask of calm, but her gray eyes met the master sergeant's. A flicker of recognition, a shadow of a shared past, passed between them. "Thorn," she acknowledged, her voice low. "It's been a long time. They told us your unit was wiped out in the Odessa incident," Thorn said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your whole team declared lost." "The reports were incomplete," Alina replied. A universe of pain and survival contained in those three simple words. It was all the explanation she was going to give. Colonel Madson finally found his voice. He took a slow breath, his mind reeling as he reassessed every interaction he'd had with her. Every dismissive glance, every condescending word. He had treated a scalpel like a butter knife. He straightened his shoulders, the ramrod posture no longer a display of arrogance, but a gesture of profound, solemn respect. He walked forward, stopping directly in front of Alina. He didn't offer an apology. Words were inadequate for the colossal error in judgment he had made. Instead, he looked her directly in the eye, seeking not forgiveness, but a chance to offer the respect he should have shown from the very beginning. His movements were sharp, precise. He brought his heels together with an audible click. He raised his right hand, fingers straight and together, and rendered the slowest, most formal salute of his entire career. It was not the salute of a superior officer to a subordinate. It was the salute of one warrior acknowledging another, a public and unequivocal admission of her true status. A stunned silence held the room. Then, following the colonel's lead, Lieutenant Harris snapped to attention and saluted. Master Sergeant Thorne, his eyes shining with pride, did the same. Evans and Chen, standing by the door, straightened their backs and brought their hands to their brows, their faces filled with awe. One by one, every soldier in the command hub, from the highest-ranking officer to the lowest-ranking private, turned to face her and rendered a salute. The sound of a dozen hands slapping smartly against helmets and brows was the only sound in the room, a chorus of respect for the quiet woman who had saved them all. Alina held their gaze for a moment, her own eyes sweeping across the room. She saw the respect in their faces, freely given and honestly earned. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of "I told you so." She simply returned Colonel Madson's salute with the same crisp, economical precision she applied to every other task. The gesture was both an acceptance and a dismissal. The past had been revealed, the debt of respect had been paid, and now it was time to move on. Later that night, long after the data core was secured and the base had settled back into its tense rhythm, Alina sat alone. She wasn't in the command hub or the barracks. She was on a simple crate outside the dusty supply tent where she had first been assigned, the place where her quiet exile had begun. The twin moons of the alien world cast long, pale shadows across the desert floor. The air was cool and clean. In her lap lay the damaged backpack. The gash from the stray round was a ragged wound in the canvas. She wasn't looking at the now famous symbol of the owl and the dagger sewn into the lining. Her attention was on the outside of the pack, on the faded, empty square where her simple black patch had once been. From a small repair kit, she took a needle and a spool of heavy black thread. She retrieved the folded black square from her pocket. It was worn, the edges frayed, a worthless piece of fabric to anyone else. To her, it was a shield. It was the symbol of her chosen anonymity, the quiet life she had tried to build from the ashes of her old one. The owl and the dagger were who she had been. The black square was who she was trying to become. With slow, methodical stitches, she began to sew the patch back on. Her hands, which could dismantle a network or fire a rifle with lethal precision, were now engaged in a simple, quiet act of repair. Each stitch was a reclamation of her identity, not the legendary one that others now knew, but the simple, unassuming one she had chosen for herself. She wasn't erasing her past. She was simply putting its shroud back in place. She did not need their salutes or their reverence. She needed only the quiet dignity of her work, the peace that came from being underestimated, from being invisible. A figure approached, and she paused, her needle halfway through the canvas. It was Colonel Madson. He stood a respectful distance away, not wanting to intrude. He didn't speak for a long time, simply watching her work. Finally, he said, his voice quiet, "They're sending a special transport for you in the morning. JSOC wants to debrief you." Alina didn't look up. "I know. Your file is heavily redacted," Madson continued. "But I read what they would allow. I wanted to say, I'm sorry." Alina pulled the thread tight, finishing a stitch. "You were enforcing regulation, Colonel. You were doing your job." There was no accusation in her voice, only a statement of fact. "No," Madson said. "My job is to know the quality of the soldiers under my command. I failed. I saw a uniform, not a person." He looked at the patch she was sewing. "You're covering it up again." "It's where it belongs," she said simply. She finished the last stitch and snipped the thread with her knife. The black square was back in its place, hiding the ghost outline beneath it. The scar on the backpack was mended. She stood up, slinging the pack over her shoulder, felt balanced again, whole. She had earned their respect, but she had no intention of living in its spotlight. She was Nyx, the ghost, the shadow, and shadows thrive best when the world isn't looking. She gave the colonel a final, small nod and walked away, a solitary figure moving through the moonlight, leaving nothing behind but the quiet hum of a base that now knew a legend walked among them.